Hi everyone, in this video I want to talk about the instructional sequence in a lesson plan, and to kind of show you what's going to be in this video. It's going to be pretty short and sweet. I try to keep these videos, less than 20 minutes at the absolute max. So we're going to continue our kind of trek through lesson planning, and this time we are ready for the instructional sequence. And today we're only going to look at a couple parts of the instructional sequence, really the anticipatory set and like how you ask quality questions. And then we'll spend a little bit of time at the end looking kind of housekeeping and what we're going to be doing in this first week as we get into some online instruction. Now, as we look at kind of where we've been and where we're going, using this backward design process, we've kind of talked about how you deconstruct standards, how you write learning objectives. We've had a little bit of practice with, writing assessments, creating assessments, that kind of thing. And now we're ready for stage 3, which is really all about the learning activities, and that's where the instructional sequence comes in. Now, when we look at an instructional sequence, it's really the order of the lesson from start to finish, right? It's very detailed. It's probably the most detailed part of the lesson plan because it's exactly what you're going to do in the lesson. It should be detailed enough that if you hand it to someone and they sat like at the teacher's desk and watched you teach, they should be able to follow that instructional sequence kind of step by step and more or less follow along with where you are. Now, it is just a plan. Typically, we deviate from whatever is in our lesson plan, specifically the instructional sequence. We deviate from that a little bit based on what happens in the lesson, but it's a good starting point because it lets you know, lets you get prepared for what you want to try and do in your lesson. Now, something may happen like there's a fire drill or something like that. Someone gets sick and you have to stop, or maybe the students aren't understanding the content really well, so you have to stop a little bit or make some adjustments kind of on the fly. But generally, you plan so that you're prepared and you have an idea of where you're going to go in that lesson. Okay. Now, as we look at how an instructional sequence is organized, it's just like an essay that you'd write, like a paper for a class, right? In a paper, you have an intro, you have the body, and then the conclusion. Okay. Same kind of concept here. You have your lesson introduction. Typically, we refer to that as like an anticipatory set, a bell ringer, a hook, something along those lines. Then you have one or more activities that your students are going to do throughout the majority of the lesson. Okay. And then at the end, you kind of close out your lesson, help your students kind of think about what they learned, what they did, that kind of stuff, so they kind of can make sense out of what happened. Okay. Now, we're going to spend a few weeks looking at the instructional sequence because there's a lot to it. Okay, so this week we're really focusing mostly on the introduction and just asking questions. And then we'll get into how do you do collaboration, how do you run discussions, those kinds of things. And this is one of those things that we could spend almost an entire semester on because there's so many different types of activities that you can do. Okay, so we're just going to kind of get into it a little bit, enough that you get kind of your feet wet, and then when you get into your residency, you'll do a lot more with different types of activities and strategies, that kind of thing. Okay, now to think about what an instructional sequence is and its purpose, it's really the sum of experiences that students are going to need to be able to demonstrate mastery of the learning objective. Okay, so what that really means is that when you write your lesson plan, you write that learning objective. It's what you're saying, what you're committing to, that students are going to know and be able to do at the end of your lesson. Okay, the instructional sequence is like how you get them there. Okay, it's describing in detail, we're going to do this, this, and this. And obviously more detail, but you specify exactly what it is that you are going to do in the lesson, and as a result of those interventions, if you will, the students will then be able to demonstrate mastery in whatever this learning objective is. Okay. Now, in our book for the class, our book by Denise White, she talks about using an anticipatory set to kind of open up your lesson. Okay, now an anticipatory set, that takes about 5 to 10 minutes of class. It could maybe take a tiny bit more, a tiny bit less. It's not a hard, fast rule, but generally about 5 to 10 minutes. And really what you're trying to do with this is create anticipation and motivation for learning, right? You want to get students interested in whatever it is that they're going to be doing, right? It's not good to just always jump straight into whatever the main activity is, right? You got to get them ready for it, right? And she refers to it as kind of priming students for learning. You're getting them ready, you're getting them hooked, getting them oriented and in the right frame of mind to be able to participate in your lesson. Now, typically, they are novel. They're kind of unique things, interesting, thought-provoking kind of situations for students, okay? And that's because interesting things are easier to remember than boring things, right? It's as simple as that, right? You want to kind of get them interested, especially in this kind of hypermedia world where there's so many things competing for our attention. It's like, how can you get students kind of tuned into whatever it is that you're wanting them to be learning about? Okay, now here's an example that you could maybe use in a social studies classroom, right? It's a campaign sign for President Trump and his re-election, and it says, "Trump, make America great again." And you might show this to students and you say, okay, so what do they mean by this? right? And you ask them to go ahead and write a short paragraph what they think that the Trump campaign is trying to communicate with this. And they take, maybe 3-4 minutes to write their paragraph, and then they go ahead and they share it with a partner, do like a think, pair, share, something like that. Okay, and you get them thinking about, campaigning or propaganda, whatever it might be. Okay, so that's just a pretty kind of easy example for you to think about. Now, the other thing that she talked about, and this was in chapter 2, are writing quality questions. Okay, now you're going to do a lot of questioning in your classrooms when you're a teacher, because that's how you get students to do things, right? You ask them a question and they respond, and it gets them kind of oriented and moving forward through whatever it is that you want them to do in the lesson. Now, you want to ask good questions, right? And White defines a quality question, or actually quality, she defines as a high level of value or excellence, right? So you want something that's of high value. And a quality question is one that requires that deep thinking and a well thought response, right? So it's not just a quick yes or no question. It's something that, I got to think for a minute before I kind of tell you what I think. Okay. Now, a good way to go through this is using Bloom's taxonomy. Now, I'm not going to spend much time talking about Bloom's taxonomy because we've already kind of done that, right? She talks about it for about 10 pages in the book, so you can go ahead and look at that content, and it really can help you write a good question, right? If you write one that's kind of higher order. Now, quality questions, like I mentioned a minute ago, are going to take a little bit of time, right? They should take time to answer, because if they can answer it immediately, it probably wasn't that great of a question, okay? If it's something that you can Google to find the answer, that probably also is a sign that it's not a great question, right? And quality questions should be asked not only by the teacher, right? You should be asking them, but you should be teaching your students also how to ask those as well, okay? And when you have good quality questions, you can really have a good facilitated conversation among your students, right? Because it gets them going deep into something and lets them get out maybe some opinions, and then they can maybe back that up with some kind of evidence or proof or whatever it might be. And it's just a great way to engage them. And then it also supports cognitive engagement and then empowers students, because if they can ask questions, that's going to serve them a ton as they get into their careers and into their lives, really. Okay, now here's a couple examples of some questions, okay? So the first question, excuse me, is a pretty simple question, something you might see in a social studies classroom, maybe in middle schools. Who was the first president of the United States? Right? Pretty simple, pretty straightforward, but it's not really a high quality question, right? It's something pretty simple, right? It's a kind of a 2-word answer, right? It's George Washington, right? You could Google it. It's not overly interesting. It doesn't make students think, right? So that's not a great question to ask. A better question is, who was a better president, George Washington or Franklin Roosevelt? And then you'd ask them to explain, right? Something like that is going to make them think a tiny bit more than maybe, just who was the first president. Yeah, it's important to know who the first president was, but maybe we should think about, like, how do we determine who was a good president and who was a bad president? And then they have to justify and explain, right? And as we think about justifying and explaining, those are at the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, okay? So this is what I wanted to cover for today in this video. Like I said, I want to try and keep these as short and sweet as possible. We're going to go into more details as we get into our online discussion for this week, and I'll talk about that here in just a shake. But one thing I want to talk about first is, if you have questions, you have to let me know. Since we're doing this online, I'm obviously not going to see you every day or even twice a week, right? We're not going to meet face-to-face for at least a couple weeks. So I'm not going to know if you're not understanding something. So I don't want to do a ton of these lecture videos, just because I think it's better if we do more discussion interaction online through the discussion boards. So when you have a question, you need to make sure that you ask the question. So there's a number of ways you can do this. One easy way is by emailing me, right? You all have my email address, so that's super easy to do. We have our online office half hour that you could attend, and if that time doesn't work, we can always set up another one for you when it does work for you, because I know everyone's schedules are kind of crazy right now. There is a discussion forum in D2L where you can ask a question to me, so you can feel free to post a question there, and I'll check that at least once a day. You could always ask someone in your discussion groups. I mean, there's all kinds of different ways that you can ask questions. If needed, we could get on the phone and talk. There's all kinds of ways. The key is you just have to ask the question, because I'm not going to be able to pick up on some of those kind of nonverbal cues. I'm not able to walk around the classroom and see what you're doing, listen to what you're talking about, get an insight into your thinking. So you have to ask the question, okay? So with that, let's talk about what's coming up. Okay, so this week, our first week online, what you need to do first off is read White chapters 1 and 2. They're pretty quick reads, some stuff in there that's pretty interesting, pretty helpful. It's a very applicable book, which is why I like it, so make sure you go ahead and read those. And I know some of you don't have your books just because of when they moved classes online. I'm working on getting a copy from the publisher that's going to be electronic in some format that you can use. If I can't get that from them, I will go ahead and scan in the entire book so that you do have it. So we'll violate copyright, but we've been told that it's okay given the circumstances. So we'll do that. That way you can get it, and that will probably happen sometime, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, somewhere in there. So if I can't get one from the publisher, that's when I'm going to start doing it. But the book is kind of long, so it's like over 100 pages, I think. So it's going to take me a little bit of time to do that if I do have to scan it in. Okay, so let's talk about discussion activity 1. So you'll notice there's 2 due dates. So let's talk about that first. So with all my online discussions I do typically in my online classes, I teach a number of classes online. So this isn't anything new for me teaching online, but what I typically do is I have 2 due dates. One's a first post due date, and I outline what you need to have done in that first post, by typically it's on Wednesdays, and for this class it will always be on Wednesdays for however we end up being online. So by the 25th of March, which is a Wednesday, you need to have done X, Y, and Z, right? And in this case, you're going to go ahead and we're working on a practice lesson plan, right? So that's kind of what we've been doing all along. You've picked a standard, you've written an objective for it, you've created a summative assessment and rubric, you've done some formative assessment stuff, and now we're getting into, well, let's make the activities so we can actually do that. Right, so that we can actually, get our hypothetical students to do or to demonstrate mastery of this learning objective. Right, so we're taking that to the next step. We're working on that instructional sequence, and the first part is that anticipatory set. Right, so you're going to integrate one of those. You're going to create your own and put it in a practice lesson plan. Right, and the idea is that you're appropriately preparing your students for your lesson. Right, you're getting them excited. You're getting hooked in. Okay, so that's the first thing that you're going to do in your initial post. Then the second thing is you're going to write 5 quality questions. Okay. And they need to engage students in higher order thinking. Now, these can be questions you can use anywhere in your lesson that you want, but I want you to write 5 of them, okay? That way you can get some practice at doing it, right? We want to try and apply some of these skills, okay? So that's what you have to have done by the first due date, the first post due date, which is March 25th. Now, I describe in more detail what I want you to do in D2L, so make sure you read that. And if you have questions, obviously contact me. Now, the other date is kind of the end of discussion date, and I always have another set of tasks that I want you to do for the kind of the last half of the discussion, right? Because everyone should have their posts up by Wednesday, and then by the end of the discussion, what I want you to do is basically just do some peer assessment, right? I want you to look at the anticipatory sets and the questions that your group members have created, and I want you to assess them for the accuracy, the quality, and to help extend their thinking, okay? So that's really the goal that we're going for here. Now, I mentioned you're in groups. So what I've done is I've created some small groups. I can't remember how many, but you're in small groups with like 4 or 5, maybe up to 6 students each. And I do that intentionally just so, one, since we're doing stuff that's more content focused, I tried to group you into like content areas as best as possible, okay? And then it's always best when you don't have the entire class to read all their discussions and try to comment on. It gets to be too much work if you try to do that, and it's not sustainable. Everyone gets burned out and no one learns. So I put in some smaller groups to help make that load a little bit less, make it a little bit easier for you to engage in these discussions, because sometimes it's a lot easier when you're talking with maybe 3 or 4 other people. You are more willing to open up to that number of people versus, the whole 22 other people in the class that would read your post. So it's a way to help you participate better. So those groups are in D2L. When you go in to do your discussion, you'll only be able to see the people in your group, okay? Now, the last thing I have up there is the assessment assignment, okay? Now, that was an assignment that was assigned before the whole coronavirus thing happened, right? So we're going to still do that assignment. We're still going to submit it, and it's something we do anyway. So what I've done is I've just extended the due date. So you have through the 29th, which is Sunday, and for all due dates, it's at midnight, right? So you have Sunday at midnight, but really nothing's late until I start grading. And even then, we're going to be really, really flexible kind of as we get started here, because we don't know how long really we're going to be online. It just kind of depends, okay? So we'll be as flexible as possible. That way everyone can be successful. And if I see maybe you have missed maybe that first post due date, I am going to follow up with you, and I will be persistent until I do get a message back from you. So be checking your email. You're going to have to be a little bit more attentive to those kind of things, just because of the change in circumstances. But we'll try to be as flexible as possible. Okay, but I have the Dropbox for the assessment assignment in D2L, so you can go ahead and upload that. And you can upload it anytime, but you need to have that done by the 29th. Okay. And with that, that's all I really have for this video. If you have questions, again, you got to reach out. Otherwise, I will see you online.